disc jockey dropped the bass. Now the heads.
According to some forms of analysis, there are two different ways in which we think about the world. There is first order thinking, which tends to be more intuitive, more emotional, more reactive, more empathetic, and so forth. And there is second order thinking, which tends to be more analytical, considered, more big picture, sort of broad, objective reasoning. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that one of these is better than the other. Each has its own role, each has its own place in society and in the way that we do things. It can be good to be intuitive, reactive and empathetic, and it can be good to be distanced and objective and analytical. And like I say, each of these plays its own role, and most of us move from one to the other along the arrow of time. Some of us tend to stick with one, some of us tend to stick with the other. Those of us who tend to even react with second order thinking can often end up in a lot of trouble with people who tend to react with or stick with first order thinking, because while they're being emotional and empathetic and so on, we're being analytical and distant and reasoned, and that can come across as bad. It can seem like we don't care about people or aren't being understanding or whatever. But in reality, neither form of these ways of thinking is necessarily any better than the other. It's entirely situational. Now, I bring this up because it really came to mind with the recent court ruling between Katie Hopkins on the one hand and Jack Monroe on the other. I guess some context is necessary, as I have been whinged at by certain people for not giving enough context in my videos and not being condescending enough, which is something I never thought I'd hear. So here we go. A couple of years ago, there was a big anti-austerity protest, or anti-conservative protest, depending on which side of the fence you happen to fall, that went on in London, and it involved a lot of vandalism, including some vandalism of a war memorial. Now, a third party not involved with either of these two was Laurie Penny, who seems to be coming up a lot recently. And she wrote some articles and comments and so on that basically can be interpreted as excusing what happened with this vandalism and so on. And of course, there's no way to piss off a conservative more than fucking with a war memorial. Hopkins, who hopefully is a horrible, horrible human being, a conservative commentator who thrives on controversy and riling people up. And so she got in a big huff and puff about this and wrote a lot of nasty things on Twitter and so on that were intended for Laurie Penny, but misdirected them, mistaking one person for the other, to Jack Monroe. If you don't know who Jack Monroe is, in the way that Katie Hopkins is a mouthpiece for the Daily Mail, for those kind of people, that kind of right-wing, blustering type, so Jack Monroe is the kind of mirror universe double of that for The Guardian. Where Katie Hopkins wins the kind of pseudo-fascist blowhard award every year, Jack Monroe wins the hand-wringing Guardianista and least effort transsexual of the world award every year. They're two sides of the same coin, basically. I guess Monroe is slightly less annoying, but if you're not following these kind of court cases and you want to see something similar to horrible cunts smashing against each other, go and watch some lesbian granny porn or something, because you'll have a better time than dealing with these two. So anyway, Hopkins, who is known for being horrible shit, says a few mean things that are intended for Laurie Penny, misdirects them to Jack Monroe. It's obvious from the context, from the replies to the tweet and everything else that's going on, that this was a mistake. There's a follow-up tweet that basically says, aren't these the same people? Or aren't they effectively the same people? Which ironically is tacitly admitting that they're not. The tweet gets deleted. That, surely in any sane and sensible world, is the end of the affair. But no, sensing blood in the water, Jack Monroe decides to sue Katie Hopkins for libel. And recently, that court case ended, and Jack Monroe was awarded £24,000 and costs against Katie Hopkins for an insult never directed at Jack Monroe. Now, if you're a first order thinker, then you're just glad that someone like Katie Hopkins, who is a
honourable cunt,
has had her long desired comeuppance, and maybe you're not going to think too hard about the implications of what has happened. If you're a second order thinker like me, or I think possibly Brendan McNeil, who's written a couple of articles about this, then you look at this and you don't care that it's about Katie Hopkins, and you don't care how much of an horrible cunt she is. You see the problems. You see the issues inherent in this ruling and how they could apply to other people and across society, at large. Especially within the context of how fucking terrible our libel laws already are. But then you start to bring up those issues, and people who are still lodged in first order thinking think you're being sympathetic or nice to Katie Hopkins when that's probably the last thing on your mind. And they will try and defend the ruling, and they will try to justify and excuse the ruling. But the ruling is shit, and there are various reasons why that is. The first major problem with the ruling, and it's a doozy, is that Katie Hopkins' comments were never intended for Jack Monroe. They were intended for Laurie Penny. So it would be up to Laurie Penny to decide whether she had a case for libel or slander and to take Katie Hopkins to court over that. They were never intended for and never genuinely directed at Jack Monroe. In the context of the tweets, this was obvious. There were plenty of replies to Katie Hopkins pointing this out, and she tacitly, implicitly acknowledged that this was so, and saying, what's the difference? I know that's not the best way of saying it, and it's not an apology, but I don't think a court can mandate that you must apologise to someone. That seems a little draconian, shall we say. But the point is, it was obvious that this was not intended for Jack Monroe. The article she was talking about was not written by Jack Monroe. Most people observing seem to have noticed that it was nothing to do with Jack Monroe. She admitted, tacitly, implicitly, in a follow-up tweet that it was not Jack Monroe. So, how is Jack Monroe libelled in this case? Furthermore, the tweet was later deleted, which is a de facto effective retraction and admission of wrong. So, how is there a libel case here? A comment that was never directed at, never meant for Jack Monroe, was mistakenly sent to Jack Monroe, but in the context of everything else, it's obvious that it was intended for Laurie Penny. So, does the law make no room for mistakes at all? And interestingly, in American libel law, it does. There's flexibility in American libel law to say that, if you made a mistake, and it's obvious you made a mistake, and there's a retraction, whatever, then there's no problem. But now it seems, apparently, in British libel law, you can make the slightest mistake in a couple of tweets, and that's it. You're fucked for £24,000 and legal costs. What sense does this make? Doesn't it make it obvious that there is then a chilling effect upon speech? Furthermore, this is an issue where the law has not caught up with technology. Now, internet spaces are a bit strange. They don't exactly fit into libel, which is written defamation, and they don't quite fit into slander, which is spoken defamation. The internet can be both. It can be pertinent or it can be ephemeral. It can be reactive or it can be considered. So a blog post makes sense to be libel. A social media post seems more like slander to me. But you've got the immediacy of the reaction and the permanence of the record going on. But things like Twitter are ephemeral. however many followers she has, I think it's something like 600,000, only a tiny fraction of those will read any particular tweet that Katie Hopkins puts out. And it will then scroll away into infinity. And you have to go digging for these kind of things if you want to find them. So in no way does it have the same impact as, say, if she'd made the same mistake in a newspaper article. And obviously there's more expectation when you write a column or an article that you have done your proper research and you've made sure you're talking about the wrong person. Things like Twitter or Facebook or whatever else are much more immediate, and there is not the same expectation of accuracy and research and so on upon you when you make a tweet. It's more conversational. It's more like, I don't know, you're down the pub talking to your mates. Oh, what's his name? Dave, yeah. I heard he molested a little girl. Dave, don't you mean John? Yeah, whatever. That's more like what Twitter is. It's immediate. There's room for mistakes. It's conversational. To hold that to the same standards as a blog or an article, or whatever, is ludicrous. And so this is an example of how the law has not caught up with technology. Next, there's a couple of legal concepts that you need to consider. The first and possibly most important of these is that when you're held accountable for a crime, two things really need to be in place for you to be entirely culpable. You need mens rea and actus rei. So basically the act needs to have happened and you need to be acting consciously to do it. So you do something malicious and you intend to do something malicious. This is why we have variations in how we apply the law. So if you if you're premeditated and you go out and you intend to murder somebody and you follow through and you do it, that's worse than if in the heat of the moment you snap and you kill somebody, or if through your negligence in maintaining your car or drinking too much or whatever, you end up driving into a bus stop full of people. So you've got premeditated murder, manslaughter, and then all the way down to pure accident where it's nobody's fault, where something just gave way or whatever and you ended up running into someone. It's not your fault. Why should you be punished for that, even though damage has been done? So we've got this whole scale of things. So in this case, Hopkins intended to insult and challenge Laurie Penny. That's who her intent was towards. Her act hit Jack Monroe. Did it actually hit her though? That's something for further consideration. Did it actually do any damage? That's something for further consideration. The other concept we need to consider is the legal standard of a reasonable person. Would a reasonable person observing this going on understand that a mistake had been made, that the wrong person had the tweet sent to them, that Hopkins knew, understood and acknowledged that they had made a mistake and retracted it? Now, that's somewhat subjective, but it is a legal standard. In my consideration, a reasonable person would look at this situation and know that the comments had been made to the wrong person, the mistake had been made, the tweet had been retracted, and the difference had been admitted. So, there's that. And then in a ruling like this, you need to decide whether damage has been done. Had a fist been swung in any case, whether it was the wrong person or not, damage would be done. There'd be culpability, liability, and an award would make sense. So, fine. This isn't a fist being swung though. This is speech. It's speech that, in my opinion, it's obvious to a reasonable person was not intended for Jack Monroe. Did it do any damage? Could Jack Monroe's reputation as a low-effort, transsexual, guardianista, hand-wringing liberal snowflake, could that reputation have been damaged further in any way to Katie Hopkins' audience of frothing Daily Mail reading, boot heel clicking proto-fascists? Could they have any worse an opinion of someone like Jack Monroe than they already had? I would argue not. In fact, I would argue that tangling with Katie Hopkins quite probably improved Jack Monroe's standing with her existing audience and probably a lot of other extra people as well. Plus, you have to consider that none of these comments were intended for her in the first place. Him, her, I don't know. and that they were intended for Laurie Penny, and it's obvious to any reasonable person observing this that this was the case. So, was any damage done to Jack Monroe's reputation? I would say no. I would say the opposite, and if I was the judge, Jack Monroe would probably be paying Katie Hopkins for the extra advertising and reputational boost that she was given. He was given. I don't know what they go by. MX. Who fuck knows? So what are the implications to this, and why is it more dangerous? Why is this a concern for second order thinkers? Well, it means there's no room in law now, even in a conversational, immediate and reactive environment, for you to make a perfectly understandable mistake. Even when the mistake is obvious, even when you admit the mistake, implicitly perhaps, but still admit it, and even when you remove the source of the original insult or defamation. Not that it even was that. It means that you can go after one person with your comment, make a mistake on who it's directed, and then be held accountable by this third party for things that you never intended to say to them in the first place. I mean, isn't it obvious that that is a problem? Isn't it obvious that if any Tom, Dick or Harry can be held accountable as if they intended to defame someone when they actually intended to say something accurate about somebody else? I mean, isn't that obvious about how much of a problem that is? That there is no leeway in law for those obvious mistakes, especially when other countries have ruled the opposite way and quite reasonably on that. Especially when our libel laws are already out of control, stupid, provide enormous awards and so on. Why isn't this obvious to people? And it appears that the reason it isn't obvious to people that this is a problem is because it's Katie Hopkins, and because they're first order thinkers and they're reacting emotively and they're looking at this horrible, horrible woman, and that's all they care about, that this horrible woman got her comeuppance. They don't care whether it was done in the right way, whether it made sense, whether it sets a legal precedent that's dangerous for other people. None of that matters. All that they care about is that someone horrible got their comeuppance. It's not dissimilar to what happened to Milo Yiannopoulos in that way. It doesn't matter how unfair or stupid or wrong what occurred was. All that matters is that the bad guy got a whooping. That's not how we should be thinking about the law. That's not how we should be thinking about our rights. A test of our principles, a test of rights, is how we apply them to people that we do not like. And in this instance, with Katie Hopkins, we have failed on that count utterly. Can you imagine a court case in which I don't know, someone was involved in a car accident and they tried to say that it was negligence or intentional, whatever. Jury finds them not guilty on the evidence, but they find that they're an execrable, nasty human being, and so they want to find them guilty on that score rather than the crime. In what world is that right or fair or just? Zang.